As few as 6 million eligible voters remain in Syria out of a population of 23 million. Around 7 million people, almost one-third of the population, have been displaced, and 2.5 million Syrians are now classified as refugees. Well, I'm joined now by Chris Doyle, who's from the Council for Arab-British Understanding. Thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning. I mean, this election has been widely condemned by the West and by opposition rebels. John Kerry has called it a sham. Does it have any legitimacy at all, do you think?
I don't think it has any at all. I mean, you're talking about an election that's being held in the middle of a civil war, so the vast majority of the Syrian population aren't in a position to vote. They're in exile, or they've been displaced, or they're in areas under a rebel control. And indeed, actually, many hundreds of thousands have lost their ID papers and therefore couldn't vote even if they tried to. That's one reason. Another reason is, as with all the electoral exercises that have happened under the Ba'ath regime, the single-party state that Syria has effectively been since 1963, it's not a credible electoral exercise. This is more like a head count where people go to an assembly and tick the fact that they are present, rather than saying we are making a choice for this particular individual. This is, though, the first multi-candidate presidential elections. But the reality is that everybody knows it's a foregone conclusion. The president will win. The other two candidates are unknown. They're not real opponents of the president as such. And this is a charade.
And as you say, they're not real opponents, are they? Why is it that no one has been able to stand from the real opposition rebels?
Well, firstly, the vast majority of the opposition don't see this as a legitimate exercise, so they're boycotting it. So many Syrians are doing that. Of course, many don't have that possibility. They feel they have to vote for their own security. They may have government jobs and lose them. So I think that's the first thing. There were many other candidates, but the criteria that you have to meet, you have to have been a resident in Syria for at least 10 years, as well as being a Syrian citizen. You have to get the support of 35 members of the Syrian parliament. Well, that is a regime rubber stamp body. So this makes it very difficult for anybody with a differing view to the president, to the regime, to stand.
If we look a year ago, President Assad, I mean, his regime was all but, about to topple. Now we look at the situation and most of the major towns are now held by government forces. What's changed? How has he had this resurgence?
I think it was always slightly exaggerated, the sense that the regime was going to topple. We heard all this talk about Assad's days were numbered, but this was not the regime of Ben Ali in Tunisia or even Mubarak in Egypt, because the regime is supported. It does have a core degree of support amongst Syria's minorities, the Alawis in particular, from which the president comes from. And for them, if they lose, they die. This is how they see it. It is an existential struggle. So you will get a significant number of people turning out today. They are loyalists to the regime and they will back it up to the hilt. This forms the backdrop of a very polarized country. And what we're really seeing here is the regime trying to demonstrate its strength. It is confident, as you say. It has made some progress on the ground, and this confidence is exhibited by showing that it can hold elections even in the midst of all this turmoil, even while still fighting, particularly in the north, and it can get out large voter numbers. I wouldn't believe for a second whatever figures that they put out later today, but they will try to demonstrate on their media large numbers of people queuing at the 9,500 polling stations around the regime-held areas. They will try to demonstrate that as much as possible they have legitimacy. How do they then use that? Its key supporters in the international community, Russia, China, Iran, will then argue that he is, Bashar al-Assad, a legitimately elected president. There can be no question of him being ousted or replaced.
Despite that, though, I mean, Assad is campaigning on a platform of unity. Whatever his allies are saying to the international community, what difference is him winning this election actually going to make on the ground in Syria? Presumably the war will just continue.
there will be very little difference on the ground at all. I mean, we're going to see continued barrel bombing of Aleppo. 50 people were killed there over the weekend. There are still going to be fighting. We're no closer to finding some sort of political solution to this dreadful crisis that has now gone on well over 3 years, has cost the country so much. And, you know, here is a man standing on a record. I mean, whatever one's views on the rights and wrongs of this conflict, you know, it has happened whilst he is president. The country has been decimated, economically smashed. The vast majority of the people now are really struggling to survive. That's no record to stand on. So I think the conflict will continue. We'll probably see further people being displaced, and the regime will attempt to take Aleppo over the next few months, backed by this confident feeling that they have this mandate.
You say it will continue. I mean, how long for? How long can this go on for? Because the economy, as you say, has been completely decimated. How can the country survive that?
Well, there's now a war economy whereby the economy is propped up by external forms of aid, whether it's from the regime supporters, but also the humanitarian assistance that's coming in. The regime, of course, now does not have to cater for the millions of Syrians outside of its own control. There's a lot of smuggling, kidnapping, extortion, racketeering. It's produced an entirely different sort of economy. And this is typical of new wars and what one sees here. So, for example, during in the besieged areas, you know, cigarette prices, you know, they get smuggled into these areas. They're sold sort of 5 to 10 times the price. People are kidnapped almost to order. And it's not all political. People are getting kidnapped for political reasons, or bribes are being paid just not to get arrested. So in this chaos, it's very difficult to have normal economic life.
OK, we'll have to leave it there for now. Chris Doyle, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.